My daughter's husband badly assaulted me and left me injured in my own driveway. When I called for help, my daughter texted back, "Stay away from us, Dad. You brought this on yourself." But what she didn't realize was that events were already in motion that would soon shake their world and leave them facing consequences they never imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. The blood on my concrete driveway was still fresh. When I received that message, my phone screen cracked from where it had fallen during the attack, but somehow still functional enough to deliver the most painful words I would ever read from my only child. The same hands that had once braided her hair for school were now trembling as I held that device, not from fear or shock, but from the surge of vindication that coursed through my veins, because every calculated move I had made over the past 6 months was about to pay off in ways that would restore the balance that had been so violently disrupted. The emergency room lights felt harsh against my swollen face, but they couldn't compare to the harsh reality that my daughter had chosen her abuser over the man who had raised her single-handedly after her mother passed away when she was just 8 years old. 23 years of bedtime stories, scraped knee bandages, school plays, graduation ceremonies, and unconditional love had apparently meant nothing when weighed against the manipulative charm of a man who had spent 2 years systematically destroying our family from the inside out. But here's what my daughter and her husband didn't understand about the man they had just crossed. I hadn't spent decades building a successful business by being reactive or emotional in crisis situations. And I certainly wasn't going to start now when everything I held dear had been taken from me through carefully orchestrated psychological warfare and physical intimidation. The assault was just the final piece of evidence. I needed to complete a puzzle that would expose the truth and deliver justice in ways that would protect not only my daughter, but countless other potential victims who deserved better than what this predator had planned for them. The hospital bracelet around my wrist would become Exhibit A in a case that had been building for months, with medical photographs documenting injuries that told a story of unprovoked violence against a father whose only crime had been loving his daughter too much to watch her disappear into the clutches of someone who had studied her vulnerabilities like a textbook and exploited them with surgical precision. The nurses who cleaned my wounds had no idea they were preserving evidence that would eventually send a dangerous man to prison for decades. And the security cameras in the emergency room parking lot had captured my arrival in ways that would contradict every lie Marcus would tell about what had happened in that driveway when he finally lost control of the facade he had maintained for so long. The pain medication they gave me helped with the physical injuries, but nothing could dull the sharp edge of betrayal that cut deeper than any wound Marcus had inflicted, because Emma's text message represented the culmination of months of psychological manipulation designed to turn her against the one person who had never asked for anything in return except the privilege of watching her grow into the amazing woman her mother had dreamed she would become. The story truly began 15 years earlier when cancer took my beloved wife Sarah on a Tuesday morning in October, leaving me alone with an 8-year-old daughter who looked exactly like the woman I had loved since college and who now needed me to become everything Sarah had been to her, while somehow remaining the father I had always tried to be during the precious years when we were still a complete family. Those early days after the funeral were a blur of casseroles from neighbors, awkward conversations with well-meaning relatives who offered advice I wasn't ready to hear, and the overwhelming responsibility of raising a little girl who kept asking when Mommy was coming home from the hospital where we had said our final goodbyes to the woman who had been the center of our universe. I threw myself into the role with the same determination I had brought to building my consulting business, studying parenting books late into the night after Emma was asleep, and learning to navigate the complex world of elementary school social dynamics, dance recitals, and playground politics that suddenly became my primary focus instead of quarterly reports and client presentations. The sacrifices came naturally, because every choice was filtered through a single question. What would Sarah want for Emma? And how could I possibly fill the void left by a mother who had been planning to teach her daughter about makeup and boys and all the mysteries of growing up female that I would now have to figure out through trial and error? I sold my motorcycle within a month of the funeral because the garage space was needed for Emma's bicycle, and the money would help pay for the private school that seemed important for her emotional development during such a difficult transition period. The golf clubs followed 6 months later when dance lessons became more expensive than I had anticipated, and my collection of first edition books was quietly liquidated to fund summer camps that would give Emma experiences with other children, while I worked the multiple jobs necessary to maintain our lifestyle without Sarah's income from her teaching position. Weekend dates became extinct not because I wasn't lonely or didn't miss adult companionship, but because Saturday afternoons belonged to soccer games and birthday parties and the endless stream of activities that kept Emma busy and happy and surrounded by friends who helped her feel normal despite the massive hole in her life, where her mother should have been cheering from the sidelines. I learned to braid hair from YouTube videos at midnight, practiced different styles on mannequin heads. I ordered online until I could create the elaborate updos that Emma admired on her classmates, whose mothers still arrived at school pickup with perfect ponytails and matching ribbons that made my daughter feel special and beautiful. The cooking experiments were legendary failures until I finally mastered the art of homemade macaroni and cheese, chocolate chip cookies that rivaled Sarah's recipe, and birthday cakes that looked professional enough to fool Emma's friends into thinking I had always possessed such domestic talents, instead of learning everything through necessity and determination to give my daughter the childhood she deserved. Marcus entered our lives when Emma was 24 and working her first job out of college, appearing at a company networking event with the kind of practiced charm that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind because I had spent decades in business learning to recognize people who said all the right things while meaning absolutely none of them, and studying every interaction for signs of authenticity versus calculated manipulation. He was handsome in an obvious way that seemed designed to impress rather than attract genuine affection, with perfect teeth that suggested expensive dental work, designer clothes that cost more than most people spent on their monthly rent, and a laugh that sounded like it had been rehearsed in front of mirrors until it achieved the exact tone needed to put people at ease while he evaluated their weaknesses and potential usefulness to his various schemes and long-term plans. Emma introduced him at our traditional family barbecue 6 weeks after they had started seeing each other, her excitement palpable as she guided him around the backyard where 3 generations of our family and close friends had gathered to welcome someone she clearly hoped would become a permanent part of our tight-knit circle of people, who had supported each other through good times and difficult periods alike. I watched him work the room with the efficiency of a seasoned politician campaigning for office, remembering everyone's names after a single introduction and asking exactly the right questions about their interests and occupations, while his eyes constantly scanned the crowd for his next opportunity to make an impression or gather information that might prove useful in future conversations or business dealings. The red flags were subtle but unmistakable to someone who had learned to read people for a living during years of negotiating complex business deals with individuals who often had hidden agendas and competing interests that didn't align with the partnerships they claimed to be seeking through our professional relationships. The way he interrupted Emma when she was telling a story about her college experiences made my protective instincts flare, though he disguised the behavior as playful teasing that made her laugh nervously while looking around to gauge whether others had noticed the subtle dismissal of her opinions and experiences. His immediate attempt to establish dominance over me was particularly revealing, as he critiqued my grilling technique and suggested improvements to my backyard setup, as if he were doing me a tremendous favor by sharing his obviously superior knowledge of outdoor cooking and entertainment, rather than recognizing that he was a guest in my home who should have been expressing appreciation rather than offering unsolicited advice. When Emma excused herself to help her aunt in the kitchen, Marcus cornered me by the fence and launched into what I now recognize was a carefully calculated assessment disguised as friendly conversation, asking pointed questions about my business operations, my financial planning for retirement, and my long-term goals, while positioning himself as the successful young entrepreneur who was obviously destined for greatness and worthy of my daughter's complete devotion and my family's acceptance and approval. I responded with polite but deliberately non-committal answers, while making detailed mental notes about his body language, his word choices, and the way his questions seemed designed to evaluate my potential as either an ally or an obstacle to whatever plans he was developing regarding Emma and her place in his carefully constructed world of manipulation and control. The transformation began subtly after their honeymoon in Italy, when Marcus started suggesting that Emma's spending habits needed serious adjustment, and that her close relationship with me might be preventing her from fully embracing her role as a wife who should prioritize her husband's needs and opinions above all other relationships and commitments that had previously been important in her life before marriage changed her priorities and responsibilities. Family dinners that had been weekly traditions for over a decade became increasingly infrequent as Marcus developed sudden work emergencies or social obligations that required Emma's immediate presence and support, and when they did manage to attend these gatherings, he dominated conversations while subtly undermining Emma's contributions with comments disguised as affectionate jokes that left her looking confused and hurt, but unable to articulate exactly why his words felt like attacks rather than expressions of loving humor. I started documenting these interactions in a private journal that I kept locked in my home office, following instincts developed during years of business dealings with individuals who exhibited similar patterns of manipulation and control that often preceded more serious problems in professional relationships that required careful documentation and strategic responses. The financial manipulation became apparent when Emma mentioned during a phone conversation that Marcus had convinced her to combine all their bank accounts for better organization and efficiency while taking over complete responsibility for paying bills and managing investments, because he was supposedly better with numbers and long-term financial planning than she could ever hope to become, despite her business degree and natural intelligence with mathematical concepts. Her beloved credit cards were canceled and replaced with a joint account that Marcus monitored closely through banking apps and monthly statements, effectively giving him complete visibility into every purchase she made and every dollar she spent on personal items or activities that he might disapprove of or consider unnecessary expenses that detracted from their shared financial goals and future security. The art classes that had been Emma's passion since college were quietly discontinued when Marcus convinced her that the monthly fees would be better invested in their future home together rather than hobbies that didn't generate practical skills or income that would benefit their marriage and long-term prosperity as a couple building a life together. Phone conversations between Emma and me became noticeably shorter and less frequent, often interrupted by Marcus returning home early from work or needing her immediate attention for urgent matters that couldn't possibly wait until after she finished talking to her father about topics that were clearly less important than whatever crisis required her immediate focus and assistance. The isolation tactics escalated systematically when Marcus began suggesting that Emma's college friends were too immature and career-focused to understand the responsibilities of marriage, gradually convincing her that these relationships were holding her back from embracing her new role as a supportive wife who should prioritize her husband's social circle and family obligations over friendships that predated their relationship and represented outdated priorities from her single years when she didn't understand what really mattered in life. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening in March when I invited Emma to lunch at her favorite restaurant without Marcus, hoping that some private time together might help her recognize what was happening to our family and her sense of individual identity before the changes became irreversible and she lost herself completely in someone else's vision of who she should become. She arrived 45 minutes late, looking exhausted and apologetic, immediately launching into elaborate explanations about Marcus needing her to handle urgent phone calls related to his latest business venture and how critically important it was for her to support his career advancement because his financial success would ultimately benefit their entire future together and provide the security that every marriage needed to thrive in an uncertain economic environment. I waited patiently until after we had ordered our meals to gently bring up my growing concerns about how isolated she seemed from her longtime friends and personal interests, carefully avoiding any direct criticism of Marcus, while focusing my observations on her apparent happiness and overall well-being during the months since their wedding that I had hoped would bring joy and fulfillment rather than this gradual erosion of everything that had made her vibrant and independent. Emma's response was immediate and surprisingly defensive, her voice rising, with an anger that seemed disproportionate to my gentle questions, as she accused me of being jealous of her marriage and unable to accept that she had grown up and no longer needed her father to manage her personal life or offer opinions about relationships that I supposedly couldn't understand because I had been alone for so many years. The words felt rehearsed and emotionally hollow, lacking the authentic passion I associated with my daughter's genuine feelings about topics that mattered to her, and I realized with growing alarm that Marcus had clearly anticipated this conversation and prepared her responses in advance to ensure that any attempt at intervention would be met with predetermined hostility and rejection that would drive a wedge between us rather than opening dialogue about legitimate concerns. When I mentioned specific examples of concerning behavior I had witnessed during recent family gatherings and social interactions, Emma dismissed them as misunderstandings or deliberate exaggerations based on my apparent inability to accept that Marcus was protecting her from people who didn't truly have her best interests at heart and were trying to undermine their happiness together. through jealousy and resentment. The lunch ended abruptly when Emma stormed out of the restaurant after declaring that if I couldn't learn to be supportive of her marriage and respectful toward her husband, then perhaps we needed to spend significantly less time together until I developed the maturity to respect the choices she had made as an independent adult woman who was perfectly capable of deciding what was best for her own future and happiness. That same evening, Marcus called me directly for the first time since their wedding, his tone superficially friendly, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of menace, as he suggested that my continued interference in their marriage was causing Emma unnecessary stress and emotional turmoil that was affecting her health and their relationship in ways that could have serious, long-term consequences if I didn't learn to respect appropriate boundaries and focus on my own life rather than trying to control theirs through guilt and emotional manipulation that he would no longer tolerate or allow to continue unchallenged. The assault happened on a bright Saturday morning in May, when I arrived at their house to drop off a carefully organized box of Emma's childhood photographs that I had been preparing as a surprise gift for her upcoming birthday, hoping that these tangible reminders of happier times might help bridge the growing emotional distance between us and remind her of the unbreakable bond we had shared before Marcus began systematically poisoning her mind against me through lies and psychological manipulation. Marcus answered the front door wearing expensive pajamas and holding a steaming cup of gourmet coffee, his expression immediately shifting from mild annoyance at the unexpected interruption to outright hostility when he saw me standing on his perfectly maintained porch with a box of family memories that represented everything he had been, working tirelessly to eliminate from Emma's consciousness and emotional landscape. Emma was still sleeping peacefully upstairs after working until nearly midnight the previous evening on some mysterious project for Marcus's latest business venture, and he made it abundantly clear that my unannounced visit was both inappropriate and completely unwelcome in their carefully controlled home environment, where I no longer held the privileged position I had once enjoyed as the most important and influential man in my daughter's life before he arrived, to claim that title through systematic manipulation and isolation tactics. The conversation escalated with alarming speed when I politely suggested that Emma might appreciate seeing these cherished childhood memories regardless of the early morning hour, and Marcus stepped aggressively onto the porch while closing the door firmly behind him as he informed me in threatening tones that Emma had specifically and explicitly asked him to handle all future interactions with me because my behavior had become increasingly problematic and disruptive to their marriage and their determined efforts to build a peaceful and harmonious life together without constant interference from family members who refused to respect reasonable boundaries. When I challenged his supposed authority to speak on behalf of my daughter and demanded to communicate directly with Emma about personal matters that concerned our long-standing family relationship, Marcus's carefully maintained facade of civility finally cracked completely and permanently, revealing the violent and uncontrolled temper that had been simmering dangerously beneath his polished surface for months while he plotted to remove me from Emma's life through increasingly aggressive psychological warfare and intimidation tactics. The first violent push sent me stumbling backward off their porch step in complete shock, the precious box of photographs scattering across their perfectly manicured lawn like confetti, while I struggled desperately to regain my balance and process the incredible reality that this man had just physically assaulted me in broad daylight over something as innocent and loving as wanting to share treasured family memories with my own daughter on her birthday, The second push was delivered with calculated force and obvious intent to cause serious harm, sending me crashing hard onto the unforgiving concrete driveway where my head struck the pavement with enough violent impact to split open my scalp and leave me dazed, bleeding, and fighting to remain conscious, while Marcus stood menacingly over my injured body, with clenched fists and eyes burning with disproportionate rage that seemed to emerge from some dark place that had nothing to do with our conversation, and everything to do with his need to dominate and control through fear and violence. The hospital room felt like a sterile prison cell, where I was forced to confront the complete and utter destruction of everything I had built, protected, and cherished for 26 years of devoted single parenthood. Staring at my reflection in the small bathroom mirror and seeing a broken stranger with white bandages covering fresh stitches and purple bruises that told the tragic story of how quickly unconditional love could be transformed into something unrecognizable and cruel when filtered through the systematic manipulation of someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push and which psychological vulnerabilities to exploit for maximum destructive impact. The emergency room doctor had been professionally compassionate and thorough as she carefully documented my extensive injuries with clinical precision, taking detailed photographs that would eventually become crucial evidence in legal proceedings, while asking probing questions about the circumstances surrounding the unprovoked assault and how such a violent encounter had occurred between family members who should have been able to resolve their differences through civilized conversation rather than physical violence. The skilled nurses who cleaned my wounds and monitored my vital signs had no way of knowing they were preserving critical evidence that would eventually help send a dangerous predator to prison for decades, treating each laceration and contusion with the same professional care they provided to countless other victims of domestic violence who arrived at their emergency department, seeking medical attention and hoping someone would finally believe their stories of abuse and manipulation. My phone had somehow survived the violent impact with the concrete driveway, though the screen was now spider-webbed with countless cracks that distorted Emma's smiling contact photo. When I finally gathered enough courage and emotional strength to call her and explain what her beloved husband had done to the father who had sacrificed his entire adult life to ensure her happiness, success, and emotional well-being through every stage of her development, from grieving child to accomplished young woman. The calls went directly to voicemail repeatedly, creating a pattern that made it increasingly obvious that Marcus had either confiscated her phone completely or convinced her to ignore all communication attempts from me because I was clearly mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. To their carefully constructed, peaceful existence that required complete isolation from toxic family influences that threatened their happiness and security. The text message that would haunt my dreams for months arrived exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes after the assault, while I was sitting alone in that sterile hospital room, trying to process how my life had reached this devastating point of complete family destruction, and wondering desperately whether Emma had any idea what had transpired in her driveway, while she slept peacefully upstairs, trusting that her husband would handle whatever minor inconvenience or disruption her father might represent to their perfect Saturday morning routine. "Stay away from us, Dad. You brought this on yourself." These 8 simple words, delivered through my cracked phone screen, managed to destroy 26 years of bedtime stories, birthday celebrations, school plays, graduation ceremonies, Father's Day cards made with construction paper and childhood innocence, and countless precious memories that I had believed would connect us forever, regardless of whatever challenges life might present, to test the strength of our father-daughter bond. The woman who had once called me her hero and solemnly promised that she would always be my little girl had chosen to side with her abuser over the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle, helped her navigate complex algebra homework, and walked her down the church aisle just 2 years earlier, with tears of pure joy streaming down his face, because he genuinely believed he was entrusting her care to someone who would love and protect her with the same devotion and sacrifice that had defined our relationship since her mother's death, left us to face the world together as an unbreakable team. The hospital discharge papers became the first official document in what I knew would become a comprehensive legal case that would expose Marcus for the predator he truly was, but they represented only a small fraction of the extensive evidence I had been systematically collecting during the 6 months when his manipulative behavior and controlling tendencies had become increasingly obvious to anyone with the experience and wisdom to recognize the calculated patterns of psychological warfare being waged against my family. The small digital recorder I had started carrying everywhere in my shirt pocket contained over 40 hours of conversations where Marcus had inadvertently revealed his true nature and manipulative intentions, often speaking candidly about his ability to control Emma's thoughts and behaviors in ways that served his personal interests, rather than her emotional well-being or individual growth as an independent adult woman with her own dreams and aspirations. The extensive collection of photographs stored on my phone and backed up to secure cloud servers documented the gradual but unmistakable changes in Emma's physical appearance and overall demeanor throughout the past year, showing a transformation from a vibrant, confident young professional into someone who appeared increasingly tired, anxious, and emotionally diminished in ways that became painfully obvious when viewed as a chronological progression rather than isolated snapshots of individual moments in time. The financial documents I had quietly obtained through legitimate channels told their own disturbing story of systematic economic exploitation and manipulation, with bank statements, credit reports, and loan applications, revealing how Marcus had gradually gained unauthorized access to Emma's personal accounts and established credit lines in her name, while accumulating substantial debt that she almost certainly didn't know existed and wouldn't discover until his carefully constructed house of cards inevitably collapsed under the weight of his criminal activities. The medical records from Emma's recent doctor visits painted an increasingly troubling picture when analyzed collectively by professionals trained to recognize patterns of domestic abuse, showing a concerning progression of injuries, stress-related symptoms, and health problems that she had consistently explained away as accidents, clumsiness, or natural consequences of her demanding work schedule and busy social obligations that left little time for proper self-care and adequate rest. The comprehensive security footage from my home surveillance system had captured numerous examples of Marcus's escalating aggressive behavior during family visits and social gatherings, documenting his territorial displays, subtle intimidation tactics, and systematic attempts to establish psychological dominance while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid direct confrontation or obvious recognition of his manipulative intentions by other family members and friends who were gradually being excluded from Emma's life. The detailed analysis of text messages and email communications between Emma and me revealed the systematic deterioration of our previously close relationship, with her responses becoming increasingly formal, defensive, and emotionally distant, as Marcus's influence over her communication patterns and thought processes became more pronounced and sophisticated in ways that reflected months of careful psychological conditioning designed to isolate her from everyone who genuinely cared about her well-being and happiness above their own personal interests and agenda. The criminal defense attorney who specialized in complex domestic violence cases was recommended by the hospital social worker, who had immediately recognized the unusual circumstances surrounding my assault and understood the telltale signs of a much larger pattern of systematic abuse that required immediate professional intervention, legal protection, and strategic planning to ensure the safety of all potential victims while building a comprehensive case that could withstand aggressive legal challenges. Sarah Williams had dedicated the past 15 years of her distinguished legal career to representing victims of psychological manipulation and financial exploitation, developing an impressive track record of successful prosecutions against sophisticated predators who used charm, intelligence, and systematic planning to destroy their victims' lives while maintaining respectable public personas that fooled friends, family members, and even experienced law enforcement professionals who hadn't learned to recognize the subtle signs of calculated emotional warfare. The private investigator she immediately recommended was a former police detective named James Rodriguez, who had spent 12 years specializing in white-collar financial fraud investigations before establishing his own agency focused on uncovering the complex digital trails that modern criminals inevitably leave behind when they believe their technical sophistication and careful planning make them invisible to traditional investigative methods and legal accountability. Within 72 hours of our initial consultation, Rodriguez had managed to uncover extensive documentation of Marcus's criminal history spanning multiple states and nearly a decade of predatory behavior, including previous arrests for domestic violence, identity theft, financial fraud, and conspiracy charges that had been carefully concealed through strategic legal name changes, deliberate relocations to new jurisdictions, and systematic destruction of physical evidence that might connect his various criminal enterprises and schemes. The disturbing pattern that emerged from this investigation was both consistent and deeply troubling. Marcus would systematically identify emotionally vulnerable women with substantial financial resources or significant earning potential, invest months in building romantic relationships based on calculated charm and false promises, gradually isolate them from supportive family relationships and friendships that might interfere with his control, gain complete access to their financial accounts and personal information, then methodically drain their resources while building debt and legal liability in their names before disappearing to begin the same destructive cycle with new unsuspecting victims. The domestic violence counselor Rodriguez connected us with had extensive experience working with survivors of psychological manipulation and had actually provided therapeutic services to 2 of Marcus's previous victims, both of whom had eventually managed to escape his control, but only after suffering devastating financial losses and emotional trauma that required years of professional treatment and family support to overcome completely. These brave women were willing to provide detailed testimony about Marcus's specific methods and psychological techniques, offering crucial insights into the systematic approaches he used to maintain control over his victims while avoiding detection by family members and law enforcement agencies who might otherwise intervene to protect vulnerable individuals from ongoing exploitation and abuse. The comprehensive forensic analysis of Marcus's extensive online activities revealed a sophisticated and carefully maintained network of fraudulent identities, fake business accounts, and deceptive dating profiles that had been strategically created and systematically used to target and exploit dozens of vulnerable women across multiple states during more than a decade of predatory criminal behavior that had somehow managed to avoid detection by law enforcement agencies that were now extremely interested in building comprehensive cases against his various enterprises. His meticulously curated social media presence was designed to project the carefully crafted image of a successful entrepreneur, devoted husband, and respected community member, but the detailed metadata analysis and recovery of deleted communications revealed a completely different reality filled with calculated deception, systematic manipulation, and predatory behavior specifically engineered to identify and exploit women with financial resources, emotional vulnerabilities, or professional connections that could somehow benefit his numerous criminal schemes and long-term strategic planning. The extensive financial investigation conducted by our team of forensic accountants uncovered a complex web of unauthorized transactions, fraudulent transfers, and money laundering operations that had successfully moved over $4 million in stolen funds through multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate-appearing business ventures that served as sophisticated covers for systematic theft and financial exploitation of victims who had trusted Marcus with their hearts, their futures, and their financial security. The credit applications submitted in Emma's name without her knowledge or consent revealed forged signatures, falsified income information, and completely fabricated employment history that had been used to secure substantial credit lines and loan approvals that Marcus was systematically draining, while Emma remained completely unaware of the mounting debt and legal liability being accumulated in her name through identity theft and financial fraud that would eventually destroy her credit rating and financial stability for years to come. The recovered digital communications between Marcus and his previous victims showed remarkably identical patterns of psychological manipulation, with carefully crafted text messages and emails that followed the same systematic techniques for emotional isolation, financial control, and psychological conditioning that he was currently employing against Emma, with devastating effectiveness and long-term destructive consequences that would require professional intervention to fully understand and address. The discovery of secret email accounts that Emma had no knowledge of contained extensive correspondence about fraudulent business deals, money laundering operations, and tax evasion schemes that implicated Marcus in a wide range of federal crimes, including organized conspiracy, racketeering, and financial fraud, on a scale that impressed even the experienced investigators who had handled similar cases but had never encountered such systematic organization and sophisticated long-term planning in a single criminal enterprise. The comprehensive analysis of dating application communications revealed Marcus's specific selection criteria and targeting strategies for identifying potential victims, with recorded conversations that showed him deliberately seeking women who had recently experienced significant loss, trauma, or major life transitions that made them more susceptible to his false promises of security, belonging, and emotional support that masked his true intentions to exploit their vulnerabilities for personal financial gain and psychological satisfaction. The criminal assault charges filed against Marcus represented only the initial phase of a comprehensive legal strategy that had been carefully designed to expose the complete scope of his criminal behavior while providing maximum legal protection for Emma and other potential victims who deserved both justice and compensation for the systematic damage he had inflicted upon their lives, their financial security, and their emotional well-being through years of calculated manipulation and abuse. The restraining order proceedings were strategically timed to coincide perfectly with the criminal charges, ensuring that Marcus would be immediately prohibited by court order from contacting Emma, approaching our family home, or interfering with the ongoing criminal investigation, while also preventing him from accessing or destroying crucial evidence that would be needed to support multiple criminal prosecutions and civil lawsuits that were being prepared by our comprehensive legal team. The civil lawsuit preparation involved meticulous documentation of every aspect of the systematic financial fraud Marcus had perpetrated against Emma over the course of their relationship, including unauthorized credit applications with forged signatures, systematic drainage of her personal bank accounts, fraudulent business investments made with her money, and the creation of shell companies that were used to launder stolen funds while building substantial debt and legal liability in her name without her knowledge or consent. The extensive evidence supporting these various legal actions had been compiled, verified, and authenticated by multiple independent sources, including forensic accountants, digital investigation specialists, medical professionals, and law enforcement agencies, creating an unshakable legal foundation that could withstand even the most aggressive challenges that Marcus's defense attorneys would inevitably mount once they realized the comprehensive scope of the case being built against their client by a team of experienced professionals. The domestic violence documentation provided additional legal grounds for protective orders that would remain in effect regardless of bail decisions or other developments in the criminal proceedings, ensuring that Emma would maintain court-ordered legal protection even if Marcus somehow managed to secure temporary release while awaiting trial on the numerous criminal charges that were being filed against him by prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. The financial fraud evidence was sufficient to support serious federal charges that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences and would involve specialized law enforcement agencies with the advanced technical resources and investigative expertise needed to fully investigate the multi-state criminal enterprise that Marcus had been operating while hiding behind carefully maintained facades of legitimate business activities and respectable community involvement that had fooled even sophisticated observers. The coordination between federal prosecutors, state criminal attorneys, civil litigation specialists, and domestic violence advocates created a comprehensive legal strategy that addressed every aspect of Marcus's criminal behavior while providing Emma with multiple layers of legal protection and professional support during what would undoubtedly prove to be a lengthy and emotionally challenging process of criminal trials, civil proceedings, and personal recovery that could take years to resolve completely. The asset seizure and forfeiture orders were prepared for immediate execution upon Marcus's arrest, effectively freezing all his known bank accounts, real estate holdings, vehicles, and other valuable property to prevent him from hiding or transferring stolen funds that rightfully belonged to his victims and would be needed for restitution payments and civil damage awards when the various legal proceedings reached their inevitable successful conclusions. The final phase of evidence collection required carefully orchestrated scenarios that would capture Marcus's true nature on record while he remained unaware that law enforcement was building a comprehensive case against him with the cooperation of multiple victims and professional investigators. The insurance claim from my assault became a quiet doorway that justified ongoing contact with Emma and Marcus, which allowed our team to document his responses to official inquiries and to observe how he tried to control the narrative, minimize exposure, and redirect blame through polished lies that sounded sincere to outsiders who did not know the context. We designed staged phone calls that Emma would make from controlled locations with clean audio, And those calls were heartbreaking to hear because they showed Marcus coaching her line by line, signaling which emotions to perform, and interrupting when she strayed toward honesty, which revealed the subtle rhythm of coercion he had used for months. Our forensic accountant, triggered by unusual deposits and withdrawals that suggested a layering strategy consistent with money laundering, obtained records through lawful requests, and the spreadsheets told a cold story that Marcus could not charm away, since every false explanation opened a new discrepancy that connected to a prior lie. Surveillance teams documented his daily routines with the patience of archivists, noting patterns with timestamps, photographs, and geotagged videos that placed him with associates already flagged in other cases for identity theft and synthetic credit profiles, and those meetings overlapped with days when victims reported sudden credit inquiries, missing checks, or phantom accounts. Detectives from different jurisdictions coordinated routine follow-up about my assault, and those interviews doubled as probes into his wider enterprise, with questions that looked simple, but were designed to cross-reference statements from business partners, landlords, and banks so that any inconsistency would ring like a bell. We also worked with journalists through formal channels, not to sensationalize, but to create a documented timeline that would later make witness recollections stronger, while warning potential new targets who might otherwise fall for the same polished routine of generosity and hustle. Former business partners, presented with limited but pointed information, began to reveal how Marcus used Emma as social proof to enter rooms he could not access alone, where he pitched joint ventures, bridge loans, and consulting retainers that were actually pipelines to new victims. We created low-friction opportunities for Marcus to talk, which he often did with reckless confidence, since he believed charm could erase facts, and in those moments he repeated claims that could be disproved by records already preserved. Even the small things mattered, like a calendar entry that contradicted a receipt, or a text that used a phrase recycled in 3 different conversations with different women, since patterns of language can be as incriminating as numbers. The trap was closing with steady, almost mathematical precision, where each move he made to cover tracks generated a new instance of obstruction, and each denial collided with a document he did not know we had, so that the cumulative weight of truth grew heavier than any single confession. By the time he realized that conversations he thought were private were actually preserved with proper consent and legal oversight, the case no longer depended on one victim's memory or one expert's opinion, but on a lattice of evidence in which financial flows, voice inflections, cell site data, and ordinary receipts all agreed with one another. What looked to him like a familiar dance of persuasion was, in fact, a slow tightening of threads that would hold together in court, and what looked to Emma like random life stress was, in fact, the visible edge of a design that had finally been mapped, measured, and named. Helping Emma recognize the truth required indirect methods that respected the restraining order, yet still reached her with clarity strong enough to pierce the narrative Marcus had built around her senses. Mutual friends who worried about her isolation received careful guidance on how to share information without triggering defensive reflexes, so they used gentle questions instead of accusations, observations instead of conclusions, and stories instead of lectures, which allowed Emma to compare notes without feeling cornered. Family members who had watched her shrink from a confident professional into someone who second-guessed every choice reached out with simple invitations and calm reminders of who she had been before. Constant gaslighting rerouted her priorities, and that tone proved essential, because judgment would have snapped the fragile line that kept communication open. We placed evidence where she could discover it during ordinary routines, not as confrontations, but as breadcrumbs, such as a copy of a public filing tucked inside a folder she regularly used for work, or a printout of a bank alert that appeared in mail forwarded to her office inbox, always arranged so that discovery felt organic rather than staged. Domestic violence resources quietly found their way into her world through newsletters at work, community bulletin boards, and links inside general wellness emails, so that when she felt a jolt of recognition, she could seek help without announcing intent to anyone who might report back to Marcus. Counseling options arrived through her employee assistance program, framed as benefits available to all staff, which weakened Marcus's surveillance because he could not object without revealing the very control he denied. And colleagues who saw changes in her affect became allies simply by normalizing the idea that support was both ordinary and deserved. Her bank enabled monitoring that flagged new credit pulls and unusual transactions in real time, which had two effects, since alerts documented misconduct while also restoring a sense of agency that abuse had eroded, and each alert was a small lantern in a dark hallway. Legal protection information flowed through community groups she already trusted, including women's networking events and professional associations, where she could ask questions about financial coercion and digital privacy without attaching those questions to her marriage. Communication with me remained indirect through intermediaries who carried messages of love rather than strategy. And that boundary mattered because Emma needed assurance that reconciliation would be available when she was ready. Yet, she also needed to move at a pace set by her own insight rather than mine. The plan was less about arguing Marcus into defeat and more about letting facts breathe in spaces where Emma could listen without fear, so the cumulative effect of small encounters began to add up as she noticed how explanations that once sounded plausible no longer aligned with documents, timestamps, and third-party confirmations. She began to recognize how constant crisis around her schedule was not random, but a tactic to keep her too busy to check statements or follow up on odd charges. And once she labeled that pattern, later manipulations lost power. Every seed we planted had a single purpose, which was to return Emma to herself, to rebuild the inner compass that abusers worked to break, and to let her feel the ground under her own feet again, so that when the day came to step away from Marcus, the decision would be hers, clearly seen and fully owned. The case file against Marcus grew into more than 3,000 pages, arranged like a city map with neighborhoods of evidence that connected by streets of corroboration, so that any reader could travel from a text message to a bank transfer to a witness statement and arrive at the same place called truth. The legal team rehearsed every defense he might attempt, including claims of misunderstanding, mutual investment risk, or bias on my part, and they prepared motions to exclude theatrics, while admitting the factual core that showed method, pattern, and intent. Media contacts were briefed with documentation that privileged accuracy over spectacle, because victims deserved dignity and because careful reporting would prevent Marcus from twisting attention into a stage for more manipulation. A victim support network stood ready with trauma-informed counselors, pro bono financial advisors, secure housing options if needed, and a call tree that could mobilize protection within minutes once arrests began, since the first 48 hours after exposure often trigger retaliation or pressure. Asset recovery plans were preloaded with civil orders, tracing charts, and contacts at institutions prepared to freeze accounts upon service, while forensic teams mapped shell companies and nominee owners across state lines and offshore jurisdictions so that stolen funds would not flow away in the confusion. Witness protection protocols were tailored to each person's risk profile, with anonymized court filings where permissible, secure transportation, and digital hygiene steps that included number changes, two-factor authentication, and social media lockdowns. Because safety was not theoretical, it was practical and daily. Expert witnesses prepared to translate patterns for the court. From the cadence of coercive control to the mechanics of credit bust-out schemes, and medical professionals documented both visible injuries and the hidden costs of stress disorders, sleep disruption, and depression that often follow prolonged abuse. I learned to convert grief into structure, to file documents instead of shouting into the void, to schedule strategy instead of replaying memories, until the work itself became a form of steadiness that I could hold when emotions surged. Detectives synchronized calendars across agencies, set shared evidence standards, and established a single source of truth for dates, amounts, and identities, which eliminated gaps that defense counsel might otherwise exploit. Meanwhile, we refined the sequence of events for the day of action, from arrest warrants to search teams to intake interviews, so that each step fed the next without confusion, and we identified potential pressure points where Marcus might try to destroy evidence or contact victims, then built contingencies to blunt those moves. Every box packed with files, every timeline printed on the wall, every audio clip labeled with time and location served the same goal, which was to make justice not only possible but likely. The transformation from heartbroken father to focused advocate was not a performance. It was a necessity born of love and responsibility. And by the time we reached the final checklist meeting, the room carried a sense of shared purpose that felt stronger than fear. The moment of reckoning was close, and everyone understood that success would mean more than a headline. It would mean a real shift in the balance of power, away from one manipulator and toward a circle of people who had decided together that truth deserved a spine. The coordinated action began at 6 a.m, when the city is quiet and doors are easiest to open with warrants in hand, and 3 teams moved at once toward Marcus's home, his offices, and the storage units where we believed records and stolen property were packed in neat cubes of secrecy. The team at the house found him in the kitchen with coffee, surprised enough that the mask slipped before he could put it back on, and for a few seconds his face showed the raw calculation of a man measuring angles, exits, and lies before comprehension settled into fear while agents read him his rights. Emma stood on the stairway, wrapped in a robe, holding the banister with white fingers as the life she had been taught to defend shattered in the plain light of day. And that sight hurt to witness, because it combined relief with grief. The relief that danger was being contained, and the grief that certainty had died. Search warrants covered phones, laptops, external drives, corporate ledgers, mail, keys to lockboxes, and documents associated with trusts and limited partnerships. And the inventory list grew by the hour, as agents photographed rooms and bagged items with labels that would later matter in chain of custody logs. At the office, investigators uncovered accounts payable ledgers that did not match bank balances, invoices from entities that existed only on paper, and email threads where Marcus gave step-by-step instructions for moving funds through intermediaries, always with language tailored to look legitimate to a casual reader. Storage units yielded boxes of false identification cards, signature samples, personal keepsakes that must have belonged to women who had escaped or been discarded, and even unopened mail that had been redirected through fraudulent change of address notices, small details that would become large in court. Simultaneous arrests hit 3 associates in other states, each tied to a link in the laundering chain. From straw account openers to a printer of counterfeit checks, which widened the case from one man's crimes to a network that fed on vulnerability. Journalists who had been preparing stories released initial reports once the cuffs clicked, and the coverage balanced restraint with clarity, naming the charges without naming victims, which helped control rumors and encouraged others to come forward. Marcus's expression during transport carried a bewildered pride, as if he could not believe the world had stopped listening to him, yet the doors closed, and the silence inside the vehicle absorbed his certainty like sand absorbs a footstep. The legal calendar would stretch into months, with hearings, motions, and discovery disputes. But this morning was a hinge that swung the story in a new direction, away from denial and toward proof. Emma's well-being remained the priority, so advocates stayed with her, explained the process, made tea, and answered questions with careful honesty, because even necessary justice can feel like loss when the dream that breaks was one you defended with your whole heart. The public exposure of Marcus's crimes triggered an avalanche that grew heavier and faster with each passing day, as victims, who had once believed they were alone, discovered through news reports and community whispers that they were part of a pattern stretching across 15 years, multiple states, and dozens of lives dismantled by the same cold calculations. The phone lines at law enforcement offices rang without pause as women called to report eerily similar experiences of being courted with flattery, isolated from support systems, pressured into financial entanglements, and then abandoned with debt and shame when Marcus moved on to his next target. And those testimonies, though painful, confirmed what our investigative file had already shown in documents and numbers. The financial investigation gained new depth as forensic accountants compared accounts across jurisdictions and found that Marcus's enterprise had siphoned more than $4 million, weaving funds through shell corporations, fictitious consulting agreements, and offshore transfers that disguised theft as business. Social media erupted with disbelief and anger, as people who had once admired Marcus's supposed entrepreneurial success struggled to reconcile the charming man they had followed with the predator now shown in mugshots. And the digital storm both vindicated victims and encouraged more to speak out, creating a chorus too loud to ignore. Businesses that had once partnered with Marcus scrambled to distance themselves, issuing statements of condemnation and reviewing how they had been deceived, while charitable organizations that had welcomed him onto boards and volunteer rosters were horrified to learn that their good work had been a shield for exploitation, prompting urgent changes in their vetting processes. Meanwhile, Marcus's hastily assembled defense team fought an uphill battle against a tidal wave of evidence, attempting to reframe his actions as misunderstood business risks or willing exchanges. Yet every argument collapsed under the weight of documents showing coercion, forged signatures, manipulated accounts, and psychological control tactics that aligned perfectly with expert testimony on abuse dynamics. Civil lawsuits multiplied as attorneys for victims filed claims seeking restitution, damages for emotional distress, and punitive judgments that would ensure Marcus's name became synonymous not with success but with ruin. And judges took those claims seriously because the evidence was abundant and the harm undeniable. A psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed a chilling portrait of antisocial personality disorder with strong narcissistic traits, describing a man who lacked empathy, thrived on manipulation, and maintained the ability to compartmentalize lies so cleanly that even trained professionals had been deceived in early interactions. Each revelation chipped away at the myth of Marcus, until what remained was not a brilliant entrepreneur or devoted husband, but a hollow figure who had spent his life rehearsing deceit and perfecting predation. And as the narrative shifted, Emma began to see her past through a new lens, recognizing that the accidents, the misunderstandings, and the business risks had all been deliberate tools in a kit of exploitation. The house of cards collapsed quickly once the first layer fell, and what had taken years to construct dissolved in weeks, with former allies testifying to protect themselves, associates turning over documents to avoid deeper charges, and institutions freezing assets at the first whiff of illegitimacy. The unraveling was not just the destruction of Marcus's facade, but the liberation of voices that had been silenced, the emergence of truths buried under shame, and the confirmation that systematic cruelty cannot forever hide beneath charm, because when light enters through enough cracks, even the most polished mask disintegrates into dust. Emma's awakening arrived with the force of a tidal wave when she was finally confronted with evidence that stripped away every veil Marcus had wrapped around her perception, leaving her face to face with the reality that her marriage was built entirely on lies, manipulation, and criminal exploitation. The recordings of his phone calls were the sharpest blade, capturing Marcus not as the loving husband he pretended to be, but as a cold strategist openly instructing her on what to say, when to cry, and how to deflect suspicion, his voice dripping with disdain whenever she wavered. Financial documents laid out in front of her revealed debts in her name, hidden accounts, and transfers that she had never authorized, showing how he had hollowed out her stability while convincing her she was safe in his care. And the cruel genius of his methods became undeniable when accountants pointed to her own signatures, forged but effective, used to justify the theft. Testimonies from previous victims painted a mirror image of her own life. The sudden shifts in affection, the isolation from family, the gaslighting that made her question reality, and as she listened, tears streamed down her face because their stories were her story, their pain was her pain, and the horror of being part of a pattern settled heavily on her chest. She realized with a sob that every warning I had given, every objection I had raised, had been born not from jealousy or control, but from love. A truth Marcus had twisted into poison so she would see me as an enemy rather than an ally. The grief was overwhelming because it came mixed with shame. Shame for defending Marcus, shame for lashing out at me, shame for building walls against the one person who had always fought for her, even as she believed his care was manipulation. Medical records that Marcus had explained away as stress or accidents now stood as undeniable proof of abuse, and Emma could no longer hide from the bruises that matched stories told by other women or the chronic exhaustion that lined her face in photographs. Financial ruin loomed as she confronted the scale of debt and fraudulent activity attached to her name, the car loans, credit cards, and mortgages she had never signed, leaving her to face a landscape of broken credit and stolen assets that would take years to rebuild. In counseling sessions, therapists explained how predators exploit grief and vulnerability, reminding her that after her mother's death, she had been especially susceptible to someone offering certainty and validation. And those insights helped her recognize she was not weak, but targeted. Other survivors embraced her, not with judgment but with empathy, reminding her that resilience is measured not by avoiding harm, but by reclaiming one's life after harm has been inflicted, and through them, she began to imagine a future not defined by Marcus's shadow. The guilt for betraying her father's trust did not disappear, but it transformed into determination, a vow to make amends, to cooperate with the investigation, to testify with courage, and to rebuild the bridge she had burned when Marcus convinced her that loyalty to him meant cutting me away. In the mirror, she saw a woman scarred but no longer blind, a daughter broken but not destroyed, and though her eyes were red and swollen, there was a clarity in them that had not existed for years. The clarity of truth, finally seen and finally owned. The long-awaited moment of reunion between Emma and me took place in the secure conference room of my attorney's office, a space chosen not for comfort but for safety, privacy, and the assurance that Marcus's influence could not penetrate its walls. For months, Emma had been shielded, guided, and supported by counselors, advocates, and friends who had helped her peel away the layers of deception that had bound her to a man who thrived on control. But now, she was ready to face me, ready to look into the eyes of the father she had once accused of cruelty and jealousy, when in truth he had been fighting for her life and freedom. When she entered the room, her posture was hesitant, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but alight with a fragile determination that had taken root during weeks of soul-searching and painful revelations. The silence that fell between us was heavy with years of lost trust, words spoken in anger, and moments of betrayal that Marcus had engineered. Yet beneath that silence there lived the unmistakable bond of blood and love that no manipulator could extinguish. Emma's apology came out in fragments at first, halting and choked, her voice trembling as she admitted the guilt of choosing Marcus's lies over my truth, of shutting me out when I reached for her, of sending that text that told me to stay away when I was lying broken and injured in my own driveway. The floodgates opened then, and her words poured forth, raw and unpolished, confessing how deeply she had been deceived, how ashamed she was for doubting me, how frightened she felt now that she could see the full scale of Marcus's crimes laid bare before her. My heart ached to hear her pain, yet I knew that rushing to forgiveness would cheapen the long process she needed to endure. Healing required patience, boundaries, and professional support, not hasty declarations that pretended the past had not left scars. I spoke carefully, reminding her that my love had never wavered, that every warning I had given had come from the instinct of a father who had already lost his wife and could not bear to lose his daughter too. And though I accepted her apology with gratitude, I also told her that rebuilding trust was a journey we would need to walk slowly, hand in hand, step by cautious step. As we talked, Emma began to share her own realizations, moments when Marcus's facade had crumbled in retrospect, when small inconsistencies she once ignored now screamed of manipulation, when her intuition had whispered, but his voice had shouted louder. She wept as she recalled how he mocked her doubts, how he twisted her love into a weapon against herself, how he used her grief for her mother to entrap her in cycles of dependency and shame. I listened, my chest heavy with sorrow, but also with a fierce pride that she had finally found the courage to see and to speak. For breaking free of psychological control is not a simple matter of facts, but of reclaiming one's voice. Outside the conference room, Marcus remained in custody, yet his influence lingered through desperate letters and phone calls, in which he tried to reassert control, alternately pleading for her loyalty and accusing her of betrayal, tactics that now looked to Emma like the transparent tricks of a cornered predator. Each attempt he made to reach her only strengthened her resolve to cooperate with law enforcement, to tell her story, and to support the case that would finally hold him accountable for years of destruction. The protection protocols in place gave us a shield against retaliation, and knowing that professionals were guarding Emma's safety allowed me to focus on the delicate work of mending our bond. In that room, for the first time in years, I saw not Marcus's victim but my daughter. Fragile but awakening, wounded but alive, ready to reclaim her life. The confrontation was not between Emma and me, but between truth and lies, between love and manipulation, between the father who had refused to let go and the husband who had nearly consumed her. And though the path forward promised challenges, it was a path we could now travel together, free from the shadow that had nearly destroyed us both. The trial unfolded over the course of 8 painstaking months, each day layering new testimony, new exhibits, and new revelations that deepened the court's understanding of Marcus's systematic cruelty and financial predation. The prosecution built its case brick by brick, presenting witnesses who described the same manipulative techniques, the same calculated isolation, the same financial frauds repeated across years and jurisdictions, until the pattern became undeniable to even the most skeptical observer. Expert witnesses translated the language of abuse for the jury, explaining how coercive control operates, how victims are groomed, how financial sabotage functions as a form of imprisonment. And those explanations gave context to Emma's story and the stories of dozens of others who had once feared their voices would be ignored. I sat through each session, my fists clenched, my chest tight, watching Marcus sit at the defense table in his press suit, attempting to maintain the air of confidence he once wore like armor. Yet behind his eyes flickered the awareness that this time his lies were not enough. The defense struggled, recycling claims of misunderstanding, portraying Marcus as the victim of vindictive women and a resentful father-in-law. But the weight of evidence was insurmountable. Forged signatures, recorded phone calls, bank statements, surveillance footage, and testimony from business associates who turned state's witness to save themselves. When Emma took the stand, the courtroom hushed, and her trembling voice carried more power than any piece of paper, for she spoke of the love that became a weapon, the isolation that became a cage, the financial ruin that became a noose, and her words pierced the jury's hearts with the rawness of lived truth. After weeks of arguments and cross-examinations, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: aggravated assault, domestic violence, financial fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and racketeering, an entire arsenal of crimes exposed and condemned. The sentencing hearing arrived 3 weeks later, and victims filled the gallery, their faces a tapestry of pain, resilience, and relief, as impact statements poured forth, each testimony another nail in the coffin of Marcus's carefully constructed persona. The judge spoke firmly, recognizing the premeditated and systematic nature of the crimes, condemning Marcus's betrayal of trust, and sentencing him to 25 years to life, with no chance of parole for at least 15 years. Civil proceedings followed swiftly, awarding $8 million in damages to be distributed among the victims, with Emma receiving the largest settlement for the devastation inflicted upon her finances and her soul. Asset forfeiture stripped Marcus of the properties, vehicles, artwork, and accounts he had amassed through deceit, ensuring that he would not benefit from his crimes even behind prison walls. Media coverage framed the case not as a scandal, but as a lesson, highlighting the importance of recognizing financial abuse, the strength of coordinated investigation, and the resilience of victims who found the courage to speak. For me, the trial was not about revenge, but about protection, about ensuring that Marcus could never again destroy another life, about honoring the sacrifices my wife once made to build a family of love. and about showing Emma that justice, though slow, could still prevail. Watching Marcus led away in shackles, no longer the master of his stage, brought a sense of closure, not triumph, for triumph belonged not to me but to the countless victims whose voices had been silenced and were now finally heard. Justice was not the end of the story, but the beginning of healing, a foundation upon which Emma and others could rebuild. Free at last from the chains of a predator whose reign had finally ended, the healing process after the trial did not unfold in a single triumphant moment, but rather through a series of quiet, deliberate steps that Emma and I took together, guided by counselors, advocates, and the simple determination to reclaim what Marcus had nearly destroyed. Our first steps were taken in family counseling sessions, where neutral ground and professional guidance allowed us to speak openly about the wounds that had festered for years. Emma often wept through those early sessions, confessing her guilt for believing Marcus's lies over my warnings, for sending me away when I was in pain, for choosing the voice of her abuser over the love of her father. Each time, I reminded her that healing was not about erasing the past, but about acknowledging it, facing it without denial, and then learning to walk forward with scars that bore witness to survival. Slowly, the heavy silence between us transformed into conversations, sometimes painful, sometimes hopeful, but always honest, and honesty became the cornerstone of the new bond we were building. The family home, once a place Marcus had turned into a battlefield of manipulation and emotional warfare, was reclaimed piece by piece. Emma and I painted the walls together, clearing out furniture that reminded her of the years she spent under his shadow, restoring the space into a refuge of safety and warmth. What had been a house of secrets became a house of light. A place where laughter could return, where photographs of her mother could be displayed without shame, where memories of love could breathe again without being suffocated by Marcus's control. My own journey shifted as well. The fight that had consumed me for years, the singular focus of exposing Marcus and protecting Emma, gave way to a new calling: advocacy. I began working with domestic violence organizations, sharing our story in carefully chosen settings to highlight the subtler forms of abuse that often go unseen, including financial sabotage, psychological control, and emotional isolation. I sat with parents who feared for their children, listening to their stories, offering what wisdom I had gained, reminding them that persistence, documentation, and love could become weapons stronger than despair. I worked with law enforcement agencies to improve their training on recognizing financial abuse as a form of domestic violence, pushing for better coordination between family courts, financial institutions, and social services, so that no victim would have to walk the same lonely path Emma once did. Emma herself, though scarred by betrayal, began finding her own strength in speaking to survivor groups, offering empathy and validation to women who doubted their own perceptions, telling them that their confusion was not weakness, but the result of deliberate manipulation, that their voices mattered, that healing was possible. The financial settlement she received, though it could never repay what was lost, gave her the chance to rebuild her independence. She paid off debts Marcus had saddled her with, restored her credit, and pursued the education she had paused during the marriage. With newfound confidence, she secured a position in a firm that valued her intelligence and resilience, colleagues who respected her for who she was rather than what she could provide, a stark contrast to the exploitation she had endured. Slowly, she began to live again, not merely survive, but live, free of the constant fear that her choices were being monitored or ridiculed. Counseling remained a steady presence in her life for 2 years after Marcus's conviction, providing tools to rebuild trust in herself and others. And each breakthrough she experienced was another victory against the shadow of his control. Together, Emma and I built a relationship more honest and more resilient than before. Gone was the silence born of fear and manipulation, replaced by conversations where even difficult truths could be spoken without fear of judgment. We honored the memory of her mother by planting a small garden in the backyard, a place Emma could sit in peace, surrounded by flowers her mother once loved, a symbol of renewal and continuity. I often reflected on the journey we had endured, the pain and the rage, the endless nights of strategy and sorrow, the courtroom battles and the confrontations, and I came to see that what mattered most was not the punishment of Marcus, though justice was essential, but the survival and rebirth of the daughter I loved more than life itself. Marcus's prison sentence ensured that he would no longer walk freely among potential victims, his days now confined to gray walls and locked doors. And though I knew he would continue to deny responsibility until his final breath, I no longer cared about his excuses. My focus was on Emma, on her freedom, on the life she could now build unshackled by his lies. The satisfaction of knowing he was gone from our lives was real, but it was eclipsed by the joy of watching Emma laugh again, seeing her rediscover passions she had abandoned, hearing her speak with confidence about the future she was determined to shape. As I began speaking publicly, I carried a message meant not only for victims, but for families. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones willing to fight hardest for your freedom, even when you mistake their fight for interference, even when you believe their warnings are jealousy or control. Love, real love, does not let go, even when rejected, even when despised, even when beaten down by betrayal, because love endures where manipulation fails. That message resonated with audiences, with parents and children alike, and I found healing in the act of turning our private pain into public advocacy that might spare another family from the same fate. Our story did not end with the fairy tale image of a family untouched by hardship, but with something far more enduring: the reality of survival, the resilience of truth, and the rebirth of trust. Justice had been served, Marcus was gone, but what mattered most was that Emma was free, her life restored to her, her future once again her own to shape. For me, peace came not from revenge, but from the knowledge that I had kept my promise to protect my daughter, no matter the cost. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.